Okay, so we'll pick up where we left off with the rest of chapter 10. And so some of the things that we had talked about at the beginning of chapter 10 was the way that slavery began to expand into the western part of the country, and at the same time how plantation owners began to benefit more profitably from slavery. And so as a result of that, they engaged in this thing that we called conspicuous consumption. We also learned that about 3% of Southern whites had more than 50 slaves. About 17% had somewhere between 3 and 6, but under 10 slaves. But the important thing here to kind of make a mental note of is that about 80% of white Southerners did not own slaves. And so this is really important because they really wield no power in the economy and no power in politics, even though they are the majority. The last thing that we talked about last time was the Nat Turner Rebellion and how the rebellion really invoked fear among not only slaveholders, but whites in general in the South. And following the Nat Turner Rebellion, we're going to see a lot of new laws that restrict the movement of free blacks that are very harsh on slaves, more harsh than they had been in the past, but also restrict the movement and the interactions between Southern whites of property or not of property and blacks, whether enslaved or free. So, following Nat Turner's rebellion, a special committee formed in Virginia, and their purpose was to discuss this crisis, they called it. And delegates from the western end of the state of Virginia really began to favor gradual emancipation. Now, you may remember that Pennsylvania adopts gradual emancipation following the Constitution. But what they say is moving forward from 1780, after 30 years have passed, when a slave reaches the age of 28, he or she will be granted their freedom. So basically, they solidify slavery in Virginia for about 60 years. So we are pretty much at the end of that 60-year period now. So we're starting to see more and more slaves being emancipated in places like Pennsylvania and other northern areas. And so Virginia says the same thing. They say, well, maybe we should enact some gradual emancipation laws, and maybe that will quiet this rebellion. Maybe if there is the promise or the hope of freedom in the future, that slaves will be content to remain bonded. And of course, we can recognize today that that is probably an unrealistic expectation, but again, it's 1830. Others favored African colonization, which we've talked about in class, this idea of sort of returning slaves to Africa where they would rebuild their lives. Now, some slaves support this idea, some free blacks support this idea. Not all slaves want to, sort of quote, return to Africa, end quote, because they were not born in Africa. But the Eastern delegates in Virginia felt like this potential of freedom in the future would encourage more rebellion. Remember, the folks in the eastern part of Virginia, the eastern part of North Carolina, the eastern part of South Carolina, those are the areas where we see very, very, very large plantations. So they really stand to benefit the most from keeping slavery in place. Remember, the wealthiest control society, they control politics and government. So we had pro-slavery advocates, men like Professor Thomas Dew, who argued that slavery actually benefited whites and blacks, and the Virginia legislature actually rejected any calls for gradual emancipation. They opted to impose new restrictions on all blacks, not just African Americans who were enslaved. So between the 1820s and the 1840s, the legislatures in the South, whether Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, all of these southern states, begin to enact new codes that were designated really to regulate all aspects of the slaves' lives. So you may recall from the last video that some slaves, if they worked in the fields and they worked in task labor, they really enjoyed a little bit of freedom. We also had some free blacks who certainly enjoyed some mobility. Immediately what happens is new codes go into place that will restrict any mobility, any freedom. The regulations increase the tensions, of course, between the wealthiest planters and the poor whites as well, because the poor whites were often responsible for enforcing these laws. So the poor whites would be sheriffs, they would be local leaders who would need to implement whatever laws were passed in state legislatures. And remember, these poor whites make up the majority of the white population, but they're also not that different from the poor slaves in terms of their place in society. Certainly a little more elevated than slaves, but don't really enjoy a lot of freedom and a lot of mobility. And so they really become responsible for carrying out these different laws. So moving on, we see that white yeoman farmers, these are the landowners who do not own slaves. So they're going to fall in that 80% of people. They were really tied to the slave system in some ways, and they recognized that their economic interests were often in conflict with the economic interests of the planters. Remember, they're not wealthy. They don't own slaves, but they're really benefiting from the fact that slave labor is in place. They also used kind of this voice that they have um, that has recently been given to them through Andrew Jackson's universal male suffrage to voice their concerns. So these yeoman farmers begin to speak out um, either for or against slavery. Some of the yeoman farmers attempted to decrease the planters' authority and control in the South. They try to do this by voting for different legislators and enacting different local laws. But they're really at the mercy of the economic importance of cotton, right? Cotton is what's driving not just Southern economy, but the Northern economy as well. The yeoman farmers and their families, they really spend a lot of time building up their communities. But then some of them begin to move westward, and their hope is that they can get away from this rigid hierarchical system of class in the South. They recognize that they might be better off than the poorest whites, and they're certainly better off than free blacks and slaves. But they also know that they will never have more land, they will never have more property if they stay in the South. And so some of these yeoman farmers begin to migrate to the western areas. Another important group that we have is the poor landless whites or the unpropertied whites. And this will also include recent immigrants to the United States. And they really resent the planters, the wealthiest people, because they dominate everything in society. But at the same time, these poor, unpropertied whites have to compete with free blacks for jobs, and at the same time, they're going to have to work for lower wages if they're able to find a job on a plantation. Because, again, if you're a plantation owner, do you pay a slave? Well, technically, no. But you would be expected to pay a wage to a landless white. And so this forces these unpropertied whites to work for minimal wages. Now, another thing is taking place at the same time in the South, and that is that we have this very small but sort of growing middle class that's beginning to develop. And with this middle class, what we really see is that they are kind of emulating their counterparts in the North. And so they like to buy things, and certainly not to excess, but they like to buy, they like to be able to have goods and services that their northern counterparts would benefit from. And so we have some distinct class groups that are emerging in the South, and this is outside of the wealthy planters. So we have the yeoman farmers and the poor landless whites, to include immigrants, and then the small middle class that's beginning to grow. This is in addition to free blacks and, of course, slaves in the South. As America is beginning to grow and becoming a stronger nation, a more economical nation, again, really connected to slavery, we start to see a lot of anti slavery views in Europe, in Central America, and South America, and beginning to take root in the northern parts of the United States. Now, I want to be clear in that there were always conscientious objectors to slavery in the South, in the West, and in the North. But the entire nation is still really benefiting from slavery. But we do start to see a distinct anti slavery movement taking root in the 1820s and the 1830s and moving forward in the northern states. So, in order to really try to protect slavery, to protect the livelihood and the wealth of these planters, the planter class, the wealthy class, begins to try to build alliances with other Southern whites, with the poor landless whites, with the yeoman farmers, and with that middle class white population. And they do this by setting up charities and setting up almshouses and things like that that would benefit the poorest whites. And so this would give them a little extra funding, a little extra food and bread. And the hope was that this would create some division between the poorest whites and the free blacks and, of course, the slave population. They also began to play on this idea of white supremacy, and at the same time on white Southerners' fears of more attacks and more rebellions like that of Nat Turner. And so they use this fear to drive very, very big wedges between the classes, the various classes. And as long as classes are divided, right? As long as we focus on the things that separate us and we don't focus on the things that unite us. Remember, only 3% of the population is very wealthy. So they're going to need to be creative. And so they do this really by invoking fear and by capitalizing on white supremacy. Now, you may recall from chapter 9, before the exam, we talked about the First Seminole War. So we'll have the Second Seminole War that takes place. And really, what's happening is we have a lot of attempts from the federal government to really restrict the movement of natives, to push these groups as far away from areas that settlers want to inhabit. You may recall that Florida now belongs to the United States, and so those natives that have been pushed back in that first Seminole War um, will begin to sort of inch out of those sort of encroached territories. At the same time that this is taking place, there is a problem of slaves who are running away, and they're running into Indian territory, down into this area where the Seminoles are. And so remember, if slaves run away, they do have to be returned. And so the federal government becomes involved in attempting to sort of bring these natives back into, I'm sorry, these slaves back. And at the same time, they are protecting um, the bounty hunters, right? The people who are going into Indian territory to retrieve these slaves. Now, the Second Seminole War lasts about 7 years, and at the end of the war, the U.S. Army captured the leader of the Seminole resistance, and only at this point do the Seminoles actually agree to not only give up the territory that they hold, but they agree to move into Western territory that is now reserved for the natives. The Cherokees also attempt to resist moving into these new tribal lands. And they try to resist this first by becoming American, like they try to Americanize themselves. Tribal leaders in Georgia actually bring a lawsuit against the federal government because they felt that the federal government was continuing to restrict their rights and their freedom, even though they were already staying on Indian territory and sort of staying on their land. The United States Supreme Court does rule in a case in 1831. Again, this is at the same time as that Nat Turner rebellion. This case is called the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. And then the next year, again, a year after that Nat Turner Rebellion, in 1842, the Supreme Court rules in a case called Worcester v. Georgia. Um, they basically do not give the tribe any sovereignty, but they do rule that Georgia does not have the right to place any state laws on the Cherokee. They basically say that the Cherokee get to live under federal law, that they are not residents of the state. Remember, if they're not residents of the state, then they can't vote. President Jackson continues to argue for the removal of the Cherokee. We've talked a little about the Trail of Tears. You have been able to take a virtual tour of the New Echota area. But Andrew Jackson, of course, now President Jackson, is arguing for the removal of Cherokees. He wants the Cherokee out of Georgia. He wants them moved into the western part of the country. He wants them nowhere near any land that settlers would be claiming. Now, some of the Northern Protestants, Northern Christians, do become involved and they speak out on behalf of the Cherokee. But without any sanction from the rest of the tribe, a small group of Cherokee men get together and they sign what's called the Treaty of New Echota. And they sign this agreement with the United States in 1836. And basically, they say, yes, we will move from this land in Georgia. But the problem here, the issue is that they are not really representative of the tribe. They're not even official leaders of the tribe. Of course, this is of no concern to the United States because now we have a document that is signed and justification to push these natives into the western part of the country. The real Cherokee leaders denounced the treaty because they would be required to exchange all of that land, pretty much as a third of it, um, for about $68 million and a relocation. We've talked about in class that money isn't really something that is important to the natives. It doesn't really have intrinsic value to them the way it does to us today. What they're interested in is their land, their homes, their tribes, their ability to maintain their customs and their way of life. In May of 1838, the United States Army forcibly removes 15,000 Cherokee from their home. They are eventually marched thousands of miles west into Indian Territory. Many Cherokee and other tribes, the Chippewa, die along this Trail of Tears. After the Trail of Tears, the Seneca natives pursue legal means to petition their removal from Western New York. Remember, we've talked about the Seneca, other groups of natives that have lived peacefully in New York alongside of the Quakers. The Quakers ally with the Seneca and helped them to petition Congress, and they were able to successfully retain 2 of their 4 reservations. So they don't get to maintain all of that territory, but they are able to maintain some of the territory. So this is a pretty busy time in the United States, in this new nation, this post Andrew Jackson election. In 1821, the Mexicans overthrew Spain and claimed Texas as part of this new Republic of Mexico. But there was a problem because there were these Comanches that were in the area, and they would raid these areas where these settlers were living. And so that made it very unstable and very unsafe. So the Mexican government hoped that they could create sort of a buffer, some people, if you will, between them and these Comanche. And so what they do is and at the time, at this particular time, what we know of as Texas today is part of Mexico. This is all part of Western and native areas. So what they do is they offer land grants. The Mexican government offers these land grants to U.S. settlers. And they basically say, you know, we'll give you this land if you come and settle this area right here as this buffer. And most of the settlers, they go and they really stay out of the reach of the Comanches. But they don't become Mexican citizens. They really consider themselves to be Americans. And so they maintain very, very, very strong ties with the United States. They don't assimilate. And by 1835, so very quickly, within about 15 years, they actually outnumbered the Mexicans that were living in Texas by about 27,000 Americans living in Mexico to about 3,000 Mexicans living in East Texas. There were also about 3,000 slaves that had been brought into this territory. So Texas is becoming very diverse ethnically and also very diverse in terms of pending conflict. So those settlers that had come to this territory proclaimed that eastern Texas would be independent of Mexico on March 2nd in 1836. And General Santa Anna, who was the new president, said, no, absolutely not. And he moved very, very, very quickly to quash this rebellion because Santa Anna did not want to lose this territory that belonged to Mexico. His troops killed all 250 rebels who were defending the Alamo, which is in San Antonio. Now, this is going to be very important because you watched that video in class, and we talked a little bit about Davy Crockett and him, you know, out in the Alamo and all of those things. But what we see immediately is very sensationalized reporting of this event, and so we have these very, you know, dramatized accounts of this battle of the Alamo. And so what happens is the United States gets very concerned about these 250, you know, innocent settlers who are just trying to live their lives in this eastern part of Texas, and they have been killed by the Mexican government. And so, of course, the United States offers immediate military assistance and support for the rebels. there are many armed U.S. volunteers, not necessarily just the military, but actual volunteers, who hope that they can achieve victory against Mexico. And so they move into this particular territory to fight alongside the rebels. They do achieve a very critical victory in April, just shortly after this event at the Alamo. And the Mexican government really doesn't try to reclaim any of the lost land in East Texas. They just sort of, chalk that up as a loss. But they also refuse to recognize Texan independence. Now, this is very important because if they don't recognize that Texas is independent, then they're still considering Texas to be part of Mexico, even though they really can't control what's going on in that territory. And so, as a result of this, the ability of the United States to actually annex Texas is very, very restricted, because if the military comes in to sort of take Texas, then this will invite an all-out war with Mexico, which the United States really doesn't want. They want the land, but they don't necessarily want a war. At the same time, there's another issue. And that issue is that, remember, we have those 3,000 slaves that are in Texas. So anytime a state comes into the Union, right, because of that great compromise and that 3/5 compromise that's embedded in there, slaves are counted for population purposes, right? So they're counted for representation and taxation. And so as a result of the slaves that are in this state, it's very unsure how the United States will want to welcome in Texas. Will it be a slave state? Will it be a free state? So, because of this issue of slavery, Congress passed a gag rule. And what they did was limit any kind of debate on slavery. So, remember, we have those in the North, those conscientious objectors who would vehemently oppose slavery. But Congress implements this gag rule and says we're not even going to discuss it. But Northerners sent petitions to the House of Representatives, and they opposed Texas annexation. And they opposed it solely based on the fact that it would be considered a slave state, and they did not support slavery in Texas or anywhere else in the Union. So finally, we have Jackson as the president, um, and his term has ended, so he's had a pretty exciting presidency. A lot of massive changes in the country under Jackson's presidency. Martin Van Buren, who is Jackson's vice president, runs as a Democratic candidate for president in 1836. But the Whig Party, which is still around, does prove to have a very disparate faction to defeat him. So Martin Van Buren really only wins by a small majority of the popular vote. But he does have a strong majority in the Electoral College. And so he is elected to be the president. At the same time, we have this tremendous British investment in the cotton industry, and the northern states are really going to experience a lot of inflation in the 1830s. And so this again is against the backdrop of slavery expanding into the Western territories. This is against the backdrop of Nat Turner's rebellion and new fears surrounding slavery. So this is a very anxious time in American history. We see some tightening credit in Great Britain, which forced those British investors to call in the loans. So they wanted any money that they had lent to the United States, whether it's to the bank, to businesses, or to plantation owners. They want this money back. And so when they take that out of the American economy, we see a lot of bankruptcy, particularly in the South. And so this leads into what is known as the Panic of 1837. As a result, the value of land falls, the price of cotton falls. Now, that doesn't mean that the sort of demand for slave labor will decrease, but the cotton itself will be less valuable. So in order to make more money, you're going to need to turn out more of the product or some alternate product. Shippers in the North were really devastated because they can turn out the product, but they have nothing to do with it. At the same time, we have a lot of unfinished canals, a lot of unfinished infrastructure in the United States. So this is a pretty scary time for the North and for the South as well as for the West. So we see this depression or this panic that really lasts through the end of the 1830s. So by 1840, the Whigs have sort of, resurfaced. They have decided who they want to run for president, and they nominate William Henry Harrison. They also selected John Tyler to be his running mate, and they hoped that Tyler's position on this nullification would attract Southern voters, even though he had been a Democrat himself. Now, this nullification is basically the idea that if a state, any state, doesn't like a federal law, they can nullify it in their own state legislature. So what that means is if you don't like a law in regard to taxation in your individual state, you can get together with your state legislature and vote and say, well, we've decided within our state that we don't support this, and so we're just not going to pay that particular tax. Now, this also means that slave states can get together and nullify any law that might potentially impact or threaten slavery. And so John Tyler supports this idea of nullification. The Whigs presented themselves also to women. Women do not have the right to vote, but they are very active in public affairs. And so Whigs tell women, we are the moral party. We are the party that will promote issues that are of concern to women. So issues like alcohol consumption, alcohol manufacturing, alcohol selling. We will work to address issues like vice, and we've talked about vice being prostitution, being gambling, being bars, those sorts of things. And so they really present themselves as the moral party. Now, the Whigs' joy over Harrison's victory is very short lived because he dies a month after his inauguration. And so Tyler becomes the president, and his Southern sentiments and and Democratic leanings really begin to frustrate those congressional Whigs. And this allows the Democratic Party to regroup, and so they will have some time in the next election. Um, this particular time period from about 1840 to 1844, again, it's very anxious, and it's a time in which the government appears to be very weak. So I'm going to pause here, and we will pick up with the rest of this lesson in another video.